ask the next question from you, Ryan. In 1988, Iran Air Flight 655 was shot down by the U.S. Military forces, and Iran did take that by U.S. Navy, I apologize, and then Iranian government took that case, referred that case to the ICJ. Could you tell us all a little bit about the proceedings, what happened, what came out of that case? Why did it fail?
For sure, and I'd like to start by thanking all of you for having me here today, and I wanted to communicate on behalf of the entire Torrey's law firm what a privilege it's been to work with the association since pretty much the early days of this, the beginning of this whole disaster, and truly all of our hearts go out to the entire community. Looking at some of the sort of analogies to this situation, because I do think the PS 752 situation is also a little bit unique, but I understand why we're looking to some of the analogies. Iran Air 655, that was an incident where that Iran Air flight was shot down by the US Navy, as you mentioned, in the final days of the Iran-Iraq War. In 1988, Iran started a proceeding before the ICJ in 1989, and it took 8 years to resolve, and it didn't even make its way through the full judicial process to a decision. What happened instead is it proceeded part way through the process and then the parties wound up negotiating a resolution before a decision was ultimately issued by the ICJ. Iran alleged before the ICJ, it argued before the ICJ that there were violations of both the 1944 Chicago Convention on International Civil Aviation and the 1971 Montreal Convention for the Suppression of Unlawful Acts Against the Safety of Civil Aviation. And I mention those only because those are still the two key international instruments that are at issue here. But the case brought by Iran before the ICJ was narrower than the one that we see Canada now bringing before the ICJ. It was essentially alleging that the United States needed to take responsibility for the incident and alleging that compensation was owed to Iran for the victims on the flight. And after about 8 years of proceedings before the ICJ, the parties spent about 2 years of negotiation in the aim of arriving at a final resolution, and they did ultimately arrive at a settlement. It was about $61 million in payments to victims' families, so that's about $210,000 US per passenger. And importantly, and I think we obviously want something different in this case, but there was no admission of liability on the part of the US or responsibility on the part of the US, and no formal apology on the part of the US to Iran.
And if you don't mind, would you please quickly elaborate on the two different types of conventions that the approach can take for everybody else's understanding, the Montreal and the Chicago Convention?
I'll stay at a little bit of a high level because this can be its own hour-long international law lecture. But the 1994 Chicago Convention at a high level sets out key obligations to ensure the safe passage of aircraft through parties' airspace and to investigate incidents in the event of any type of crash. That convention was not designed specifically for the situation in which a state's armed forces shoots down a plane. It's much broader, but that is the high-level obligations set out in the Chicago Convention. The 1971 Montreal Convention is much more targeted, I'd say, and much more concretely applicable to this circumstance, in that it provides for specific obligations in respect of ensuring the safety of civilian aircraft, refraining from taking acts against civilian aircraft, and actual providing for the obligation to conduct criminal investigations in respect of any sort of incident that does occur. So
through this approach, non-financial compensation matters are discussed and become clear, hopefully, for the families.
It sets out a series of actual obligations to prosecute in a criminal manner any violations of the obligation to ensure safe passage of aircraft, basically.
Yeah, and the big picture goal here is to hopefully prevent from such things happening again in the future. Yeah. I do like to touch base on a couple other cases. Obviously, the case of flight PS752 is quite unique, the circumstances of how it happened, but if we have time, I'd like to come back and talk to you a little bit about the Air India flight 182 and the Pan Am 103, but hopefully we will have time for that.